Descending 300 feet below the ocean surface to repair a structural crack on a massive offshore oil rig is an exercise in absolute sensory deprivation. The water pressure at that extreme depth is immense, constantly pressing against the heavy reinforced canvas dive suit like a physical living weight trying to crush the metal helmet inward. The ocean is completely pitch black, stripped of all natural sunlight from the surface world above, leaving the diver isolated in a tiny artificial bubble of illumination provided by the shoulder-mounted halogen lamps. The water temperature hovers just above freezing, a biting cold that seeps through the insulated layers. The only sounds that exist down in this crushing abyss are the loud, mechanical hiss of the oxygen regulator feeding you life, the exhaust bubbles escaping the valve, and the rhythmic, hollow thud of your own heartbeat echoing endlessly inside the confined brass space of the helmet. Vance had been doing commercial saturation diving for 7 grueling years, and he knew how to manage the suffocating isolation of the seabed. He secured his heavy magnetic boots to the rusted steel crossbeam of the rig's lower support structure, wrapping his thick gloves around the underwater welding torch. A blinding arc of blue and white sparks erupted, illuminating the thick clouds of marine snow and sediment floating lazily in the freezing current. About 10 minutes into the meticulous repair work, the primary communications channel in his earpiece crackled with severe, localized static. The voice of his topside supervisor broke off entirely, replaced by a low, rhythmic frequency that sounded like a heavy piece of solid iron striking a hollow steel pipe somewhere further down the dark structure. Vance immediately killed the welding torch, letting his eyes slowly adjust back to the dim, focused beams of his halogen lamps. He unclipped his secondary safety tether, leaning dangerously over the edge of the massive crossbeam to look down into the impenetrable black void below the rig's foundation. At the very edge of his light's reach, clinging effortlessly to a vertical drainage pipe, was a pale, humanoid shape. It was a figure completely devoid of any diving gear, pressurized suit, or thermal protection. The skin was a bloated, sickly white, reflecting the harsh light with a greasy, unnatural sheen. The figure was holding a massive, heavily rusted industrial wrench, methodically slamming it against the steel pillar in a slow, deliberate rhythm that vibrated violently up through the soles of Vance's heavy boots. The impossible, nightmarish reality of the situation temporarily paralyzed him. The water temperature was lethal, and the crushing pressure at this depth would collapse unprotected human lungs instantly. Yet the figure suddenly stopped striking the pipe and slowly tilted its head upward to look at the light source. The face was entirely wrong. The jaw hung slack at an unnatural broken angle, and the eye sockets were completely hollow, filled with nothing but the dark, freezing water of the ocean. Without making a single swimming motion, the pale entity began to smoothly ascend the vertical pipe, sliding upward against the incredibly strong ocean current with terrifying, effortless speed, its pale hands gripping the rusted metal as it headed straight for Vance's platform. Vance frantically scrambled backward, his heavy magnetic boots clanking clumsily and loudly against the steel grating as he desperately reached for the emergency surface deployment valve on his chest rig. The water around the edge of the platform suddenly disturbed the resting sediment into a thick, blinding cloud of mud. From the murky water, a bloated, gray hand with completely dissolved, ragged fingernails reached up over the ledge and clamped firmly onto Vance's thick yellow air umbilical cord. The creature didn't try to pull him down or attack him directly. Instead, it pulled a jagged, rusted piece of jagged sheet metal from its side and began violently sawing into the thick rubber hose that provided the only source of oxygen from the surface ship above. walking the subterranean transit tunnels after the massive subway system shuts down for the night is a job strictly reserved for those without claustrophobia. At 2 a.m., the sprawling underground network is plunged into near-total darkness, smelling heavily of damp, rotting concrete, electrical ozone, and decades of old iron dust. The high-voltage third rail is supposedly powered off from the main grid, leaving the long winding stretches of track completely silent and cold. The veteran maintenance workers call these solitary shifts ghost walks. You walk miles of curved, dripping brick tunnels with nothing but a heavy-duty tactical flashlight and a radio, meticulously checking the steel rails for hairline fractures, loose spikes, or debris left behind by the massive trains that roared through these arteries hours ago. Elias was 3 miles deep into the decommissioned section of the Red Line, a stretch of crumbling tunnel that hadn't seen civilian passenger traffic since the early 1990s. The air down there was incredibly stagnant, thick, and hard to breathe. As he swept his flashlight over a rusted, overflowing drainage grate, a distinct vibrating sound echoed off the curved, tiled walls from further down the pitch-black tunnel. It was a heavy, rhythmic thrumming noise, followed by the unmistakable high-pitched screech of metal wheels grinding forcefully against curved steel rails. Elias froze in his tracks, his leather-gloved hand instinctively going to his two-way radio. The sound was impossible to mistake. It was the heavy, aggressive approach of a subway train heading directly toward his position. He immediately dropped his gear and pressed his body flat against the filthy, wet tunnel wall, sliding frantically into a narrow, shallow maintenance alcove cut into the brick. His mind raced with panic. The transit authority dispatcher had explicitly confirmed the entire sector was dead, and the main electrical breaker was physically locked out with a padlock. A multi-ton train couldn't possibly be moving without the third rail feeding it power. But the rumbling grew exponentially louder, shaking the loose gravel and old wooden ties beneath his steel-toed boots. Elias aimed his flashlight straight down the center of the track, waiting for the blinding, massive yellow headlights of a rogue engine to cut through the darkness. Instead, the beam of his light caught something entirely different, emerging from the deep shadows. It wasn't a train of any kind. Charging down the center of the subterranean tracks was a tightly packed, chaotic group of incredibly tall, emaciated figures. There were at least a dozen of them, running aggressively on all fours with a jerky, synchronized, insect-like, mechanical precision. Their heavy, bare, calloused feet slapping violently against the wooden railway ties, combined with their long, pale hands scraping against the steel rails, created the exact acoustic illusion of a multi-ton transit train rolling down the tracks. They had no distinct facial features, just smooth, grayish, sickly skin pulled tight over protruding bone, and they were moving at a terrifying, relentless speed, perfectly coordinated in the absolute dark of the tunnel. Elias abandoned his heavy canvas tool bag, turned on his heel, and sprinted back the way he came, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically against the damp, decaying walls as his breathing turned ragged. The horrific mechanical screeching behind him grew deafening as the pack rapidly closed the distance, their hands tearing at the gravel. He reached a heavy, reinforced iron maintenance door set deep into the concrete wall and threw his entire body weight against the rusted handle. He slipped inside the small electrical room just as the leading figures slammed violently into the heavy metal from the other side. They didn't try to turn the handle or force it open. Instead, they simply resumed running in place against the iron barrier, their hands and feet constantly, endlessly scraping the metal, perfectly mimicking the sound of a train idling in the dark. Operating a massive 12-ton rotary snowplow during a high-altitude mountain blizzard is exactly like driving through a solid, suffocating wall of white static. The ferocious storm completely erases the horizon line, the asphalt road, and the night sky, leaving the driver suspended in a chaotic, disorienting void of swirling, freezing snow. The heavy diesel engine roars beneath the floorboards. The massive front steel augers chew aggressively through 6-foot compacted drifts, and the cabin heater blasts dry, hot air relentlessly against the freezing windshield to prevent ice buildup. It's an incredibly isolating, lonely experience. You are entirely alone in a machine built to carve paths through nature's most violent and unforgiving conditions, trusting only the dim orange glow of the dashboard instruments to keep you from accidentally driving off a sheer mountain cliff. Miller had been clearing the blocked interstate pass for 6 exhausting hours straight, pushing his heavy rig through a relentless storm that had already dropped 40 inches of fresh, heavy powder. The powerful halogen headlights mounted on the roof barely penetrated 10 feet into the swirling whiteout. Around 3 a.m., the massive plow suddenly lurched violently forward, the front steel blades grinding harshly against something solid and dense hidden deep within the drift. Miller eased his foot off the heavy throttle and squinted through the heavily frosted, wiper-streaked glass. Standing perfectly centered in the middle of the uncleared buried highway was a snowman. It was huge, nearly 7 feet tall, packed tightly with dense, dirty ice and highway grit. There were absolutely no footprints around it, just undisturbed, deep snow in every direction, assuming it was an elaborate, frustrating prank left behind by stranded motorists. Hours before the storm reached its peak, Miller carefully steered the heavy rig around the icy structure, tires slipping on the black ice, and continued down the desolate pass. But exactly 2 miles later, the high beams illuminated another distinct shape in the snow. It was a second snowman, completely identical in size and shape to the first, standing directly in the center of his lane. This one had 2 jagged black rocks pressed deep into the frozen head where the eyes should be, staring directly at the approaching headlights of the plow. The sheer impossibility of a human being building this during a blinding sub-zero whiteout sent a cold, heavy knot of dread directly into Miller's stomach. He adamantly refused to stop the vehicle in the dead of the storm. He gripped the heavy leather-wrapped steering wheel with white knuckles and plowed straight ahead, letting the massive spinning steel augers completely obliterate the icy structure into a cloud of white powder and shattered rocks. But the relief of destroying it was agonizingly short-lived. Less than 50 yards ahead, a third giant snowman appeared in the headlights, then a fourth. They were lined up perfectly along the invisible center line of the highway, spaced exactly 20 feet apart. As the headlights finally hit the 5th frozen structure, Miller instinctively slammed on the heavy air brakes. Buried inside the translucent, tightly packed ice of this snowman, clearly visible under the bright halogen beams, was a dark, spindly, contorted shape that looked entirely too biological and too human to be made of tree branches. The massive 12-ton plow skidded to a violent halt on the black ice beneath the snow, its diesel engine idling loudly in the freezing wind. Before Miller could reach for the emergency dispatch radio on the dashboard, the oversized head of the icy structure slowly tilted to the side, cracking loudly as the thick frozen crust broke apart. Long, dark, completely hairless limbs burst out of the packed snow, moving with terrifying, unnatural speed. The creature leaped effortlessly across the hood of the massive rig, its freezing heavy body slamming violently against the reinforced windshield. A pale, severely frost-bitten hand with needle-like elongated fingers pressed flat against the glass right in front of Miller's face, leaving a rapid web of instantly freezing thick ice branching out across the pane, permanently sealing the doors shut and trapping him inside the cabin. Piloting a heavily retrofitted Boeing freighter over the absolute middle of the Atlantic Ocean at 3 in the morning is the pure definition of complete detachment from humanity. There are no sleeping passengers, no flight attendants making rounds, and absolutely no ground lights visible below. Just 30,000 feet of empty, freezing thin air, and a dark, churning ocean that means certain death. The cramped cockpit is dimly lit by the soft green glow of thousands of aviation instruments, accompanied by the constant, hypnotic, deafening drone of the 4 massive jet engines outside the reinforced glass. The heavy bulletproof steel door locking the 2 pilots away from the cavernous, unpressurized cargo hold behind them is the only physical barrier between the quiet cockpit and thousands of pounds of strapped-down industrial freight. First Officer Cole was quietly monitoring the autopilot trajectory while the captain rested his eyes in the fold-down jump seat. They were hauling heavily sealed, unmarked shipping containers from a private military contractor out of Germany. About 4 hours into the long-haul flight, the aircraft's critical weight distribution sensor on the center console suddenly flashed bright yellow. The digital readout indicated a massive, impossible shift in the plane's center of gravity. The extreme weight was moving steadily and rapidly toward the tail of the aircraft. Cole frowned, tapping the glass of the monitor. The massive cargo pallets were secured to the floor deck with heavy industrial-grade steel chains. Unless the turbulence was catastrophic, which the radar showed it wasn't, there was absolutely no physical way multi-ton containers could be sliding smoothly across the ribbed aluminum deck. He immediately switched the dashboard's secondary monitor to the internal infrared security cameras mounted high up in the cargo bay. The screen flickered with static, showing the long, dark, tunnel-like fuselage filled with rows of massive metal boxes. The heavy chains were perfectly intact. The cargo itself hadn't moved a single inch, but the weight distribution indicator continued to shift rapidly into the red zone. Cole grabbed the internal communications handset to broadcast a warning over the hold's intercom speakers, but as his thumb pressed the transmit button, he realized the line was already open. A soft, wet, sickening whispering sound was coming through his noise-canceling headset, transmitting directly from the empty, freezing bay behind them. It sounded like dozens of distinct, hushed voices speaking in unison, completely cutting over the loud engine noise. The captain woke up instantly as the heavy reinforced cockpit door suddenly rattled violently in its metal frame. Cole dropped the headset onto the console. The red security indicator light, positioned directly above the door handle, illuminated. Someone, or a large coordinated group of somethings, was actively trying to turn the heavy locking mechanism from the other side of the steel. Cole rapidly checked the digital flight manifest on his tablet. They were officially the only 2 living souls on the entire aircraft. The air pressure gauge for the cargo hold suddenly plummeted to absolute 0, triggering alarms indicating that the massive rear loading ramp had just been manually unlocked and opened mid-flight, exposing the back of the plane to the freezing, deadly, thin atmosphere. The heavy steel door bowed inward slightly as a massive, synchronized impact struck it from the unpressurized cargo side. The heavy industrial hinges screamed and bent under the immense pressure. Cole reached behind his seat for the emergency crash axe, his hands shaking violently as the low oxygen warning klaxons began to blare deafeningly in the small cockpit. Another deafening, bone-shaking strike hit the metal, leaving a deep, perfectly formed imprint of several massive, clawed hands, denting the thick steel inward. The wet whispering over the dropped headset grew into a chaotic, overlapping, screeching static, right as the heavy internal deadbolt on the cockpit door finally snapped in half with a loud, echoing metallic crack. Working the graveyard security shift in a subterranean corporate data center is a highly isolating and profoundly unnatural job that messes with your internal clock. Sub-level 4 is located hundreds of feet beneath the concrete city surface, consisting of seemingly endless identical geometric aisles of towering black server racks. The artificial environment is kept freezing cold to prevent the delicate hardware from overheating, and the noise level is physically unbearable. Thousands of heavy-duty, high-speed cooling fans create a deafening, continuous roar of aggressive white noise that completely drowns out footsteps, human voices, or any other ambient sound. You walk the long, sterile, polished corridors, guided only by the thousands of blinking green and blue LED lights of the processing units, feeling entirely disconnected from the surface world, buried alive in a tomb of technology. Barrett was exactly halfway through his 3 a.m. mandatory patrol, walking down the center of aisle section G, when the environment subtly but noticeably changed. It wasn't the noise. The massive fans were still screaming at top speed. It was the ambient lights. Starting from the very far end of the long corridor, the thousands of tiny green indicator LEDs on the server racks began to shut off sequentially. It was a perfectly synchronized rolling wave of darkness moving steadily toward him, plunging rack after expensive rack into complete, suffocating blackness. Barrett pulled his heavy tactical flashlight from his utility belt, stepping backward cautiously as the sweeping darkness swallowed the final row of machines, leaving him standing alone in the only remaining pool of overhead emergency light. He aimed his powerful halogen beam down the massive, now darkened aisle. The towering servers weren't just turned off. They had been physically and brutally destroyed. The thick, industrial-grade fiber optic and high-voltage power cables had been violently ripped from the back panels, leaving exposed, sparking wires. The heavy black cables were strewn across the raised, perforated floor tiles like dead, thick snakes. As Barrett cautiously moved forward, sweeping his light across the concrete ceiling, he noticed something massive hanging between the overhead aluminum ventilation ducts. The thick, ripped cables had been dragged upward and meticulously woven together into a massive, dense, complex structure resembling a horrific, mechanical spider's cocoon suspended in the dark. The bizarre structure was slowly, rhythmically pulsating, the thick rubber wires shifting and groaning audibly under a heavy shifting weight from inside. Barrett reached for his shoulder radio to call the surface security desk, but when he keyed the mic, his radio only broadcasted the exact same deafening roar of the server fans, completely drowning out his frantic voice. From the top of the woven cable nest, a long, incredibly thin, multi-jointed appendage uncoiled and dropped down. It wasn't made of wire or plastic. It was pale, jointed biological bone, covered in a thin, translucent layer of gray skin, ending in long, hooked metallic claws that looked like they had been violently fused with sharp server components and motherboards. The entity dropped completely from the ceiling, landing heavily on the raised floor tiles with an immense crashing impact that Barrett felt vibrate right through his heavy boots. though the sound itself was entirely masked by the screaming, cooling fans. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall, its hunched body a grotesque, terrifying fusion of pale, emaciated, sickly flesh and thick black fiber-optic wires threading aggressively in and out of its torso. It didn't have a human face, just a smooth, pale, dome-like head embedded deeply with the blinking green lights it had stolen from the servers, moving with terrifying, completely silent speed. It began sprinting down the dark aisle straight toward Barrett, its metallic claws tearing up the heavy floor tiles with every impossible massive stride.